Hey everyone, it's Micah at Service Reef, and today we are with Christina Aulick, who's a global missional life pastor at Engedi Church. And we're so excited to have this conversation about looking at building a sending church and building that into the DNA of what you guys do on a regular basis. Christina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Micah. It's awesome to be with you, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Christina, tell us a little bit about yourself and what is it that you do and a little bit about your journey that brought you to this place.
Yeah, great question. So, I serve as the Global Missional Life Pastor here at Engedi, as you mentioned, and I give oversight and leadership basically to all things global missions. And we do a whole variety of different things, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit. But yeah, that's my passion area. And my husband and I started our church in 2005. So we had two young children at the time, and then we had a church, and then we had a third biological child. So everything was happening kind of all at once. And I joined the staff about 11 years ago, was able to kind of step into this position because we had some transition, and it's an area that I've been involved with since the inception of the church. And honestly, I can't believe I get to do this for a job. It's awesome. I love it. And yeah, it's a privilege to serve in this capacity.
That's awesome. Tell me a little bit about your journey into missions. Like, what was your first global missions, or when did you kind of feel that calling, or something that like, hey, this is a little bit more than normal,
Yeah.
if that makes sense?
Great question. So I was actually born out of the country. My dad was in the Vietnam War and served in the army. And so I was born in Thailand, but I was only 2 months old when my family left. But I always knew there was like this world that was bigger than my, everyday experience. And so it was always kind of an interest. And then I went on my first mission trip when I was newly married, and we went to the Dominican Republic, and our church partnered with an organization on the ground that was doing like home building. And so I saw poverty, material poverty, I think at a level I hadn't seen before. And I just started to have a little bit of a stirring, but it wasn't until some years later we were starting to learn about the AIDS crisis. This is about 20 years ago. And we were taking a leadership team through the young adults ministry that my husband led at the time. And there was an opportunity to go to sub-Saharan Africa, to Zambia, to see firsthand what was happening and how our church might be able to partner. And so there was this opportunity, but interestingly enough, I was pregnant with our second child. And I should know right here, like at the time, it didn't seem unusual, but looking back, I should have known something was afoot, because my husband was like, hey, we're going to take a team, and who wants to go? And I'm like, well, you're not going without me. I'm going. And to make that happen, we had to leave our firstborn, our 2-year-old, at home. And then we had our daughter, and she was 5 months old when the trip was happening. So 4 months in, I had to stop nursing her, like left her with my family. And I look back and I'm like, that's not normal. And I think whenever we see those signs of like, that's not normal, that really points to calling. And when I went on this trip, I mean, God just got a hold of my heart in a very fierce way. I saw extreme poverty, and I saw suffering, and I realized that what these broken things that were happening in the world weren't just material issues or governmental issues. They had spiritual roots. And I heard things about lies that the enemy was perpetuating to really spread rumors and beliefs that were things like, if you have sex with a virgin, you can get cured from AIDS. I mean, these are spiritual issues at root. And I just came back from that experience, honestly, like I didn't know what to do with it. And soon after we got reacclimated, I just started living out of that like place of change. I didn't want to leave it there. And, fast forward, I just started doing things that I didn't know were, abnormal. I started mobilizing all the people I could, and the resources and awareness. And I was just like, okay, we've got to do something. And I've got to bring people in that journey with me. I don't feel at this time in my life I'm called to go long-term to the field, but I do feel that I'm called to mobilize people and resources to places of urgent need. So that's the theme. And I think it kind of really was pivotal during that Zambia trip in particular.
Thank you. tell me a little bit about the journey of Engedi. Because I feel like that's a natural stepping off point for you come back from this journey, you're starting your family, and then kind of Engedi, and you guys get
Yeah.
called into this space. How did you guys go about kind of trying to figure out what the vision of this church needs to be? And how did these experiences influence that piece of it?
Yeah, great question, because they're definitely connected. So, like I said, when we were in, pre-Engedi days, we were just learning all about what is happening in the world, and I think we were just really compelled to not just learn things, but to take action from what we learn. And so, the calling to start Engedi is probably another interview. um, but the Lord called us to start Engedi, and we knew when that calling was made clear that we wanted to be an outward facing church, an outward focused church, and a church for the world. And in fact, our mission statement is to advance the kingdom revolution of Jesus worldwide. And, we don't want to be insular and just, I don't know, Christians that kind of get a little bit self-absorbed, I guess. And so we tried to keep our programming pretty simple so that people could live out the things that we were teaching. And early, like from day one, we were trying to be involved. So in fact, this is a little trivia. Our very first offering we dedicated 100% of it to drill clean water wells in Zambia. And our very first church partnership globally was with, through the experiences that we had had previously. And so we just started as we meant to go on. We decided that 25% of our budget would be dedicated to needs outside of our walls, locally and around the world. And so this is just kind of what we wanted to create as normal. And then over time, what are we doing and why, and getting more strategic, developed over time. But I think it's really difficult if there are, people that listen to this interview that are on the early stages. It's really difficult to make the pivot when you're, years into the journey versus trying to start and hold fast to things that are maybe against the momentum naturally, where you just think, okay, we just got to take care of us right now. Well, if you start that way without an outward focus, it's a lot more challenging to change later. So so that's how we started. And then just over the years, we've had some 2.0, 3.0, adjustments in terms of like how we're doing things and what we're doing, but that core has remained the same.
That helps. Christina, give me a little bit of understanding of how have you guys structured your particular mobilization missions department within the church, and how does that kind of function as a piece of that, just to kind of help folks like at a 10,000-foot level have kind of some understanding of where this all fits for you guys?
Yeah. So I would say at the topmost level, we have 5 core values as a church, and everything that we do flows out of those values. So if it's not connected to a value, we respectfully decline. And one of the values is to bless our world with servant love as we tell about good news of Jesus. And so that is obviously elastic, and it's not just global, but global is a big part of it. So that's kind of like our main playground, so to speak. But because it's one of the main values of our church, every ministry area touches it. And so we really try to, I'll explain this in a second, be the champions of that part, but we really work hard to destroy silos and to collaborate across ministry areas as much as we can, so that we're speaking with a united vision and voice. So in terms of structure, like I said, I'm the global missional life pastor, and then I have 2 staff members that work on my team. I have a global sending coordinator and an administrative support. And then we have some volunteer teams that work with us. We have a global sending team, and those volunteers are acting as coaches who take people through our sending process for mid to long-term mission sending. And then we have a global member care team that is really the week-to-week touch point, care point, emotional, spiritual support, practical support for people serving long-term in the field. And then we have a global prayer team, and the global prayer team is really designed to advance everything possible through prayer. And we have a culture of prayer as a church, but they're really looking like at the 10,000-foot view of like, what are the needs in the world? How can we pray towards those? What are the needs of some of our people on the ground? And how do we get in the, trenches and bridge the gap for them? And really, how do we champion the cause of prayer across our global teams? So we come together and pray, even though we have a prayer team that's the champion for that. So that's kind of the structural piece. And then I would say a couple of key elements kind of going back to what does this look like in terms of implementation across the church. We try to do a really good job of storytelling. So we have a planned, annual calendar that allows us to tell really good stories. And oftentimes that's through video, but sometimes it's a live, like 4-minute interview on the platform, on a Sunday morning, or other creative ways, being in person, but we're trying to really tell good stories that people can identify with, they can see themselves in, and that their heart gets touched. And then we're working with each ministry area to kind of help them figure out how they can identify people with potential to engage in missions, and how we can support each other in mobilization and just advancing global engagement.
That's awesome. Kind of staying at that higher level for a moment, Christina, walk me through like an ideal journey of like, how does someone like, hey, I'm first feeling, I'm sitting in the audience, I see this, I'm sitting in the congregation, or I feel a call, or what's kind of an ideal journey? And then the follow up to that is, how do you start to track engagement as a church?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the ideal journey, that's an interesting question to sort through. I think most people in mobilization, at least in church.
Let's be fair, Christina. It's not a fair question because everyone's journey is unique.
That's true.
It's not fair, but I'm saying, like in a very high level, like what would a normal process be is kind of what I was trying to get to.
Yeah, sure. I think we would always want to be on the more proactive side of those conversations, but oftentimes they feel a little more reactive, like we're trying to catch up with someone. But the ideal scenario would be something where, someone is really invested in the life of the church, and they're in a small group, and they're serving, and they're giving, and this is their home. This is their church family. And through a series of, opportunities to be exposed to missions, like maybe they've heard a story, or maybe their small group has gone through some material that touches on this information, God starts to prick their heart, and then they surface. And so when they surface, they might say something as simple as they're possibly interested in a short-term trip. Or they maybe they're just asking a lot of questions, or they start simplifying their life and making cross-cultural relationships and these kinds of things happening. So there are signs that like God's working, if they're starting to be more generous financially towards these priorities, then we have a conversation with that person, and we invite them in. So typically that would look like either someone in their life, like a small group leader, saying, an I see in you conversation. I see in you this heart for the world. I see that you're simplifying. I see that you're building relationships. Have you thought God might be calling you to something more? And then they connect with our team. That's like one really great scenario. Another really great scenario is they've already decided to go on a short-term trip. And then coming out of that experience, we work really hard to disciple people well before the trip and to connect with them well afterwards. And so, our process, we really want to always offer next steps to people, no matter, anywhere in the organization, but that they just don't remain stagnant, or they don't just have head knowledge, but that they're living out, the experience or the touch point the Holy Spirit has in their life. So like with short term, they might go on a trip, and then we're looking for those signs, like who's expressing a lot more interest or a lot more heart, and are they saying any of these telltale phrases, or expressing like relationship building that's beyond what we orchestrated for the team. And then we'll again have some of those I see in you conversations, but also pair that with some very accessible next steps to help people just take a step And if they're willing to take the step, we're willing to kind of take them through the next phase of the process.
That's awesome. Help me understand for you guys, both at a church level and then within your department as well, how do you measure some of that engagement? Like, what are things and granted, we know that like life change is hard to measure, right? So, but are there certain key points that you focus on when you're trying to measure engagement to pair with maybe those stories that you're telling as well?
Yeah. So as a church, we have an annual survey that we do every single year. And then each department has metrics that are associated with our annual goals. And the goals are based on the values. So there's a kind of a culture of tracking and of metrics and data. And I think it's really important, side note, before I say a couple of things for our department, a side note to that is I've heard people say, well, isn't that just being all about the numbers? Like, how do you leave room for the Holy Spirit to work in there? And I don't think those two things are opposed. I think they work together. Because, the book of Proverbs tells us to know the state of our flock. And so part of the way that we do that is through objective, measurable data, and then the maybe the intangible information, which is just the anecdotal stuff or the sense that you have, the X factor. So, those X factor things are hard to put on a spreadsheet, but they're important. So I think for us, for some of the ways that we track engagement, of course, we're looking, short-term trips. I think the statistic is before someone goes long-term, they've gone on 4 to 9 short-term experiences. And so we really value doing short-term trips well and stewarding that well so that we can hopefully build our pipeline to long-term sending even better. So we're tracking key data in our short-term process. Obviously, the number of people. We're looking at what percent of the church does that represent. We look at how many of the people that go on a trip in a year are first-time participants. We track how many people pursued mid to long-term sending within a year after a short-term trip. We look at how many people joined a global serving team, like an ongoing US-based team. We look at how many people pursued trip leadership. So those are some of the data points we're looking at for short term. And with mid to long term, we're processing how many people are in our process. So we're tracking that, how many people were sent. We're also looking at numbers to track people through our first phase of our sending process, our assessment phase, because even if they don't actually get sent, we still see it as a value that they went through the assessing and we discern together. It's either a yellow light or a red light or a green light. So that's still a value to us. We also track giving to our missions fund. So how many givers are there? How does this relate to maybe previous years? We're looking for trending and things of that nature. Just to kind of help us get a feel for the dynamic and not just that snapshot of time.
I think that's awesome. And the two things I hear in that, just reflecting a little bit, Christina, is one, having a vision for long-term, right? Like we're trying for those that this is the path that they need to be on, right? Others might be in a giving space. They may be in a prayer space. They may be in a, hey, I'm helping encourage people, to get involved space, but we all have a role to play. But for those that are going to long-term, it's having that focus from the very beginning of the short-term, as you're preparing them to go into a short-term trip, right? And as you respond after, how do you engage people? Like if someone serves with that or goes on a trip, how do you keep them engaged, kind of post-trip?
Yeah, great question. So when a team comes back, they have a debrief meeting with our sending coordinator, and one person from our global sending team, one of those coaches, sits in on that debrief meeting. And the hope is that that can be an extra set of eyes and ears to watch for some of those signs where we might see evidence of something stirring towards a longer call or something more when it comes to going. And coming out of that debrief meeting, the sending coordinator and the sending team coach, they're able to say like, hey, did you hear, this person say this comment? What did you make of that? Or if it's pretty obvious, they'll just connect right away and say, hey, do you want to grab coffee? I heard you say this, and it sounds like there's something really cool that might be good to process together. And I'd love to hear more of your story. And that's really a great natural way to make a connection versus something that feels more like I'm going to go online and fill out a form to an unknown Wizard of Oz somewhere, like this is it's just more relational, and our culture is a relational culture here. So I think that helps a lot. And then we have some suggested next steps for everyone coming out of a trip. It's like, okay, consider joining one of our teams. Here are the team opportunities. Consider being part of an event that we have coming up. Here are those opportunities. Or if you're feeling this stirring to something more, a longer commitment, here's the next step you can take. Like, go to our sending process, fill out the interest form, or sign up for another trip. So we're giving some, we don't want to give too many options because then it's like noise, but we try to give some, targeted opportunities that we're discussing in person, we're reinforcing in email, and then the team leader is also kind of, giving that information. So we're trying to hit it up from a few different angles.
That's great. Well, one more question kind of in that space. What do you feel the biggest challenges in getting kind of everyday people to buy into a vision of mobilization?
That is a huge challenge. First of all, let's just say that. I think when it comes to, global mobilization specifically, it's much more challenging for people to be in touch with on a heart level, something that they're not seeing and experiencing. And it's, an out of sight, out of mind kind of idea. And it always continues to shock me, really, how uninformed people can be about some very massive issues. And in the space of global missions specifically. So, one example of that is we know that 42% of the world still lacks access to the gospel, but not even all church pastors know that information. And so we have to really do a good job of helping people connect with the realities, like the realities of what does the Bible say? What is God's heart? First of all, like that's the most important thing. So we've got to be helping sensitize people to, on their discipleship journey of understanding what God's heart is. And then B, what is the state of the world? We've got to keep that in front of people, but we need to do that in a compelling way so that they can see themselves in the story. They can see the need of a child in Nepal and understand how does this relate to me as a mom of a young elementary age child myself, just, I think having those points of commonality. And so we've got to help it feel understandable, well, just known, understandable, and relatable. And then once we can help people connect, the next challenge is giving them a manageable and accessible next step. Because I feel like it's just malpractice to just inform people and then not give them a way to actually move forward. Because then they're just burdened. But if we can move that, we can catalyze action if we can give them an accessible next step. So whenever we're informing people, giving them a way to move forward practically, pairing those together. So I think that's a really big challenge when it comes to mobilizing people, for missions. And honestly, it's very countercultural to pick up and leave your home and your language and your family. I mean, this is radical Christianity, and radical Christianity is normal, but it's still very, countercultural. So I think we need to keep that in mind too, that, we can lay these really good plans, but it's the Holy Spirit that's really got to call someone to come and die and to do whatever he's asking, no matter what that looks like. So I think that's another just obvious, but very big challenge when it comes to mobilization.
Help me understand a little bit of those next steps. Cause I feel like a lot of times in our Western mindset, and I'm guilty of this myself at times, you're like, oh, well then I'll throw money at it. Right. Or I'll go
Yeah.
do this. Like, can you give me an idea of what some of the next steps are? Yes, donations may be a piece, but like there's lots of other ways to get involved. And so are there some examples of maybe calls to action or different ways, next steps that you've provided in the background? Just give me a idea of what these might look like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends, on the time of year in our church calendar, because like I said, we're trying to really not be so complex organizationally that people are maybe not as effective in moving, engaging and moving through like kind of a discipleship process. So wherever we can, we're trying to link arms, discipleship wise with what's going on with the church. So for example, we do 21 days of prayer and fasting in January. Well, how can we link that experience to maybe, as a next step to something that we're also trying to disciple people along with global missions? So that's one example, but I think some really great next steps for people, you can kind of pick from the category buckets of, what are some specific ways people can be praying and resources that go around that? Maybe there's an app that you want to use, or maybe there's a prayer resource for your missionaries, or a newsletter, or something like a specific prayer resource or experience. Giving, I do think, is really important. And I think when it's done from the standpoint of not like, I'm going to write a check and forget about it, but I'm going to write a check and be invested in the story, and we bring people in and we really value them and say like, hey, this is a way that you are helping catalyze action, but it doesn't stop here. Make sure that you're relationally connected to needs and that your heart's engaged. And then I also think, just whatever we can do to help people have in-person experiences, either with someone who's on the field when they're returning, or maybe over Zoom, maybe, there are creative ways that we can get our mission field involved, from across the world. Maybe they're Zooming into a small group meeting or something like that. Telling their story on a Sunday morning and helping people get to know them that way. But really a personal connect is great. And then getting them on a short-term team. I'm telling you, like that's where it's at. This is so catalytic. I have heard so many times people's story comes back to what they experienced when they saw firsthand. I mean, nothing replaces that. Not everyone needs it, but I do think it's really helpful when it's done well.
Right.
Oh, another
Yeah.
opportunity that just
Mhm.
came to my mind too, like a small group study or a book. One resource I really want to recommend is the Center for Mission Mobilization puts out a little 7-session study called Explore, XPLORE. And we've actually distributed this to our entire church, and we're getting ready to do it again this fall, but it's required reading for our staff. It's a suggested like new small group. Here's what you can work through in the first year. Like anybody and everyone, we're trying to get this into their hands, but it's a really great, like I said, it's 7 sessions. It's just like 60 some pages, little booklet that's all about God's word, God's world, and God's work. I think that's kind of how it summarizes the whole thing, really going through a biblical basis for mission and what you can do with it. So getting a study or discipleship material into people's hands, I think is a really great thing that you can do. And then they can decide, what's the Lord calling me to do?
That's awesome. So that's called Explore. And then who produces it, Christina?
The Center for Mission Mobilization.
Mission Mobilization. Okay. I'll look that up and we'll get that added in show notes and stuff.
Yeah,
So
sweet.
awesome. Okay. One other question, Christina, is you're in a space where you guys were able to build this kind of within the DNA of what Engedi is, right?
Mhm.
As you interact with your peers, not everyone's in that same space. Some
Right.
people,
Most people
like,
are not.
most people are not.
Yeah.
Help me understand, like from your perspective, when you have those conversations, when you sit over coffee, what are some of the struggles others are facing? And then what advice or other things have you felt has been helpful on their journey to try to help promote that and start to build that more into the DNA of their church?
Yeah, I think, for sure, how we started is, on one end of the spectrum. And I think there are a lot of churches kind of in that other space of like, hey, this isn't how we started, or our senior leader doesn't necessarily share this huge passion that I have, and how do we work with that? So I would say, a couple of things that I've heard from other churches, and then in my own observation as well. But I cannot underemphasize the importance of leading up. And even though we started the way that we did, I'm still the champion for all of this content and all of this whole area of ministry. And I am the one who's the subject matter expert. So I need to be the one who's learning and taking in the, a vast amount of information, distilling it down to what's essential, and making it sure it gets to the people of influence. So I'm sharing, up and laterally and down as much as I can, but leading in all directions. Get your senior leaders, share with them key podcasts or articles or books. Don't overwhelm them, but make it accessible. Or maybe it's a key point of data that you read. Doesn't have to be the whole book. It could be one factoid and how it impacted you. But keep that in front of them, get them on trips, get them in front of people that you're working with, your partners, your global organizations you're working with, or your long-term workers. Take them out to lunch, do whatever you can to expose them directly to the front lines, because then they internalize that vision and they become your biggest advocate. So I would say, that's something I work a lot on. And even though my husband and I started the church, I report to our executive pastor. So this is still like a real thing that I work on too. But I think that's really important. And then additionally, I work very intentionally to lead laterally. So every year I do a look ahead meeting with all of our department heads. And during that meeting, it's kind of around the time of year that we're setting goals for the upcoming year and looking ahead. I am able to just talk with them and say, hey, here's what we're going to be, working on within global over the next year, and some themes and some different ideas. I'm curious, what do you guys have cooking, and what are you thinking about in terms of like what might be a good fit for missions engagement in your area of responsibility? If you don't know, let's brainstorm together. If you do have some ideas, let's piggyback on that, and like let's lock arms and see how we can take those things and make them even more effective. How can I resource them? How can they get on board with, the broader church initiatives? Get your department heads, exposed to those same people and those same articles and factoids that I mentioned, because you can't assume that they're knowing, that information. You are the champion. So be the megaphone for it and be the connector, but be intentional to use your influence. And then obviously, with the team, your teams and the church at large, you want to do the same thing. But I think if you can multiply yourself through other, areas of influence and other leaders, then it's going to make your job 100 times more effective.
And it could be in the similar vein, or it could be something different. Christina, what's one of the bigger challenges that you're facing within kind of your role or within your body currently?
Yeah. Well, we've had an interesting journey post-COVID. We've been just in that rebuilding process for our mid to long-term sending. So, sending is a huge deal to us, but it's only one part of what we do. That being said, it's a huge deal to us. And the good news, the headliner good news, is we're seeing record engagement in our short-term sending, which is awesome. And but our mid to long-term sending pipeline hasn't quite rebounded yet at the level that our short-term is outperforming anything that's ever happened in the past. So that's really great. I think it's being done more strategically. I think the Holy Spirit's doing his Holy Spirit thing that I can't quite put on the spreadsheet, but we're trying to, be intentional and strategic, and coming out of those trips being really, working really hard to help people continue to move forward. And we see some good signs of people who have gone on trips. I can give you some names right now, and they're preparing for bigger commitments already, but not at the level that I think we would have expected at this point in the journey. So we're just trusting. We know that God's given us a calling and he's really lined things up, but it's up to him to build the house. So that's where we're at, and we're seeking any and all feedback. So if people have ideas, I'm all ears.
No, I think that's great. And I think it's learning to trust, right? In that space of like, okay, are we operating out of fear or trust of like, okay, God, you've got this.
Right.
There's going to be a right timing for the right person at the right, when that opportunity arises too. Like it's, there is a dual-sided model almost to it. It's funny. You only see that sometimes looking back, right, Christina?
Yeah.
When you look back, you're like, oh
Right.
yeah, that wouldn't have even been ready for them 3 months ago or 8 months ago or 9 months ago.
That's
So,
absolutely right. Plus there, and maybe if there are other church leaders that are able to watch this, I think there's been, I think they call it the great reshuffling coming out of COVID, where people are changing churches and all of that. But we also here at Engedi have a very high number of people who have not even been in church before, or they've only gone like a few times in the last year. Like a lot of people with not a lot of background, a lot of new believers, and that's awesome. We celebrate that. But the discipleship process, when it comes to those metrics we were talking about before, that looks different. I think there's going to be a little bit of a lag because of just how God's working in our context, where we have people who are unfamiliar with, they don't know what the Great Commission is. They don't know any of these things. We have people who never had a Bible before, so allowing time for these roots to take place, I think, is important. But there was, I think there's just that kind of line of demarcation of who was here before and who's here now. And then how do we restructure and build around who's here now?
That's exciting. That is,
Yeah,
that's
it's
really exciting
awesome.
though.
It's awesome.
All right. So I have to ask, just because, we're doing this for Service Reef, I guess, a little bit, but can you share me a story of of how Service Reef has either helped you or your team in the past? What's your journey or experience been like?
Yeah, well, we are super thankful for Service Reef. I think for us, like the big things for us is Service Reef is more user friendly than other tools we've used in the past, and it's just easier for us on the staff side, but also our people who are participating on the going side and the donating side, just a lot more user friendly. The thing that we love the most, I would say, is everything's all in one place. So we used to have like Google Sheets for, well, you saw them, Micah. They were not pretty, but so many tasks on all the different Google Sheets. Nothing was automated. And so everything was very manual. I do this, now I have to tell you to do that. And we have to make sure that all the things got done, but we don't necessarily always remember because the reminders we have to create every single time. And that's just on the task management side. So the task management piece was really helpful because we had spreadsheets for some things. We had a project management software for another thing. And then we had a short-term trip software for managing donations and rosters and that type of thing. So we were spread across like 3 to 4 platforms, I would say. Now we have everything in one spot. And so that is just music to my ears when I think about working smarter and not harder, that my team's able to do the value add stuff and not spend so much time trying to manage the tool. Like I always tell my team, the tool works for us. We don't work for the tool. So we really feel like Service Reef works for us, and it's been really awesome. We started just using it for short-term trips, and our short-term trips scaled up significantly. So thinking about like how much time we're saving is huge. And then we integrated the short term with our mid to long term process. So now start to finish, we can see everything that somebody's doing when it comes to going globally, and that's just a huge piece of looking back and saying, oh, I can see they did this trip, then they filled out an interest form to go longer. And, and I can match them with a coach. And it's really cool to see that like bird's eye view of one person's journey.
That's awesome. It's music to my ears because that's the heart behind it, for sure.
Yeah.
As we kind of wrap up here, Christina, is there any one piece of advice that you would like to share with others coming into this missions or mobilization space? Any advice?
Yeah. This may sound overly simplistic, but I think sometimes the way of God is simple. That doesn't mean it's easy. And I would say when it comes to mission and mobilization, obviously we need to do the work. We need to lead up. We need to collaborate with our peers. We need to instill vision. We've got to multiply ourselves. We got to be strategic. We got to keep learning, all the things. But I think ultimately we've got to stay on our knees. That's Jesus said to pray to the Lord of the harvest. And if we are not doing that, if we're not praying to the Lord and doing what Psalm 127 says about allowing the Lord to build the house, otherwise the builders labor in vain. If we're not living that out from a heart posture, even if we have the best tactics in place, it doesn't really matter. We're just going to be building something that will crumble or that is causing us stress and challenge. And our God is not a God of stress and chaos. He's a God of peace and order. And so when we're living with open hands to him and reliance on him, praying for him to do what only he can do when it comes to calling people to leave everything for the sake of the gospel, we better be on our knees. That I just think that's where it's at.
Thank you. Any other recommendations or any book recommendations, podcasts, follows, other things that you listen to or get encouraged by?
A few books come to my mind. I mentioned Explore. I think another great book for churches and organizations, missions organizations as well, but just making sure you're on the same page with the role of the church is called The Sending Church Defined. And that's by Zach Bradley. And it helps really churches recover their understanding of their role in mission. I think another great one that's out there is When Everything is Missions. I love that book by Spitters and Ellison, just really clarifying, what do we mean? What does the Bible mean, when we're saying mission? And then this isn't really a missions one, but I've been through this book, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 times in different capacities, small groups with staff. And then it's part of our sending process. We take everyone through The Emotionally Healthy Leader by Pete Scazzaro. And no matter what space you're in, this is a good book for life, and highly recommend the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality series, but Emotionally Healthy Leader is a great resource for anyone in leadership or going, to represent Christ in a leadership capacity.
Thank you. Are there places where if people wanted to find more about Engedi or about you, are there anywhere you would suggest for them to go?
Yeah, I would say, our website's great, engedichurch.com. And definitely, if you're interested in all things global, go to engedichurch.com/global, and you'll find a lot of these things there. We're pretty present on social as well, at Engedi Church, at Engedi Global. You can find me on Instagram. You're going to get a little bit more of my family there, but it's at Christina Aulick. And we also have a podcast that my husband launched in January called Made to Advance. So this is really just a way to help people take the next step in their life so they can have a flourishing life. And it's been really fun to just hear from different leaders and maybe not even all leaders, just people with the unique ways that God's worked in their life to help them advance, whatever that looks like. So that's been a really fun addition to the mix.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Any questions, Christina, you wish I had asked?
I don't really have any that necessarily come to mind. I feel like this is a great overview of what does mobilization look like and how do you get in the weeds on it. So I just thank you for what you're doing. We're so grateful for you and the way that you serve our church, and that you would have a heart to make something like this available to church and mission leaders is awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and our heart is to try to no matter where you are in the space, hopefully be able to advance, hear other ideas, get that process. So thank you so much for your time today, Christina. Really appreciate the conversation. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for your time.
You bet. Thanks, Micah.
Hey guys, Micah with Service Reef, and just want to recap a great conversation with Christina at Engedi Church and the excitement of what God's doing there, within there, and building that within their DNA and within all that they do. And so super excited to have that. Hopefully you guys take away a couple things with engaging leaders and how do you get folks on board, and some of the encouragement there to share stories, find ways that they can, in digestible chunks, to kind of get them to do that. Helping mobilize people, the catalyst that short-term missions is. I believe Christina used that term. It's such a great term. So blessings on you in your journey, wherever you find yourself, and excited to step to that next step for you, wherever that may be. And so in the meantime, you'll find some of the notes below. Feel free to subscribe to the channel and continue this conversation. We're looking forward to it. Blessings this week.